What's up, TUMNAD Lectures? In today's video, we are going to be looking at what we call the intestines. But if it is your very first time to watch me, please make sure you subscribe. You put on the notification bell so that whenever I load the video, you are the very first person to watch. So let's go ahead and get started and look at what we call the intestines. Okay. Now, the intestine is going to be one of the main components of what we call the gastrointestinal tract, or which you people call what we call the alimentary canal. So now, this kind of the intestine is going to be part of the alimentary canal, and we're going to be finding the intestines within what we call the abdominal region. Okay, and of course, you're going to be having these kind of the intestines moving straight from what we call the pyloric sphincter. Okay, the pyloric sphincter down up to what we call the anus. Okay, so now the intestines generally are going to be starting from what we call the pyloric sphincter, and it moves down up to what we call the anus. Are we together? So now the intestines, we are going to be having two kinds of the intestines. You're going to be having the small intestine and also going to be having what we call the large intestine. So let's go ahead and see the anatomy of what we call the intestines. Okay. Now, starting with what we call the small intestine. Okay. Now, the small intestine, of course, by the word small, they are going to be having a narrow diameter. Okay, they're going to be having what we call a narrow diameter. So now, this kind of the first portion of the small intestine, this one which is a bit blue, you know how it is called? This one is what we call the duodenum. Okay, this one is what we call the duodenum. Okay, it's what we call the duodenum, and the duodenum is just close to around 25 centimeters long. Okay, it's just close to 25 centimeters. It is close to 25 centimeters, 25 centimeters long. Okay. Now, next, what we call the duodenum also have this kind of this portion of what we call the small intestine. This one which is a bit green. You know how this kind of this portion is called? This one which is a bit green is what we call the jejunum. What we call the jejunum. And this jejunum is close to around 2.5 meters long. Okay, it is close to 2.5 meters long. It is super very long. Okay, and then we also have this kind of another portion of the small intestine, this one which is a bit red, the one which is super very long. You know how this one is called? This one here, which is a bit red, this one here is what we call the ileum. And the ileum is the longest portion of the small intestine. You know how long it is? It is approximately around 3.5 meters long. Okay, it is approximately around 3.5 meters, 3.5 meters long. Okay, so now generally that is what we call the small intestine. You're going to be having the duodenum, the jejunum, and then the ileum. It is the ileum which is the last portion of the small intestine that unites or that transition to another kind of what we call the intestine, which we call the large intestine. Now, this kind of the ileum, as it comes towards this bulbar structure, which is going to be part of what we call the large intestine, you're going to be having a very important kind of the sphincter that regulates how much of the content leaves the small intestine to jump into what we call the large intestine. You know how this valve is called? This valve here is what we call the ileothecal valve. Okay, so now that kind of the valve is what we call the ileothecal valve that regulates how much of the content leaves the small intestine into the large intestine. Okay, it is also another beautiful thing of this valve located between the ileum and then also what we call the cecum. Okay. Now, when we come to this large kind of this intestine, the whole of this one is going to be what we call the large intestine. The fact that it's just large by the diameter, it's just simply called the large intestine. You can even simply call it also what they call the colon. Okay, so now we're going to be seeing now this first segment of the large intestine, which is a very big bulbar structure. You know how it is called? This one here, the largest part as you begin what we call the large intestine, this one here is what we call the cecum. Okay, is what we call the cecum. Now, The cecum, on its inferior aspect, it has a finger-like projection that goes down. You know how this finger-like projection is called? This kind of the finger-like projection is what we call the appendix. Okay, is what we call the appendix, and the appendix is super very important lymphoid tissue that's going to be aiding in what we call little bit of what we call the immunity within what we call the intestines. It is such another beautiful thing. Okay. Now, as you move up from the cecum, we have this kind of the ascending colon. Okay, this one is what we call the ascending colon. So now this one here is going to be what we call the ascending. Okay, what we call the ascending colon. The fact that it's just moving up is what we call the ascending colon. Okay. Then the ascending colon, as it just moves, and then it is this angle. Okay, this angle is just what we call the hepatic flexure. Okay, we're going to be having what we call the hepatic flexure, this angle, the transition of what we call the ascending colon as it moves to another kind of this colon. You know how this colon is called? This colon here is just we call the transverse colon. Okay, so now this one here is what we call the transverse colon. Okay, and then as you move down, the transverse colon is going to be now making this corner. You know how this corner is called? This one here is what we call the splenic flexure. Okay, is what we call the splenic flexure. Then it moves down. The colon moves down. You know how this colon is called here? This one here is what we call the descending. The descending colon. Okay, what we call the descending colon. Now, as you move down, we also have this portion of what we call the large intestine. You know how this portion is called? This one here is what we call the sigmoid colon. Okay. And then lastly, we also have this portion which we simply call the rectum. Okay, which we simply call the rectum, that houses the fecal matter temporarily before it is expelled. And then the last part of what we call the gastrointestinal tract. You know how it is called? This tube is super very important in pooping out this poo-poo. You know how this structure is called? This structure here is what we call the anus. Okay, is what we call the anus, the last part of what we call the gastrointestinal tract. Super very important. Okay. Now, having looked at the anatomy of what we call the intestines, let's go ahead and look at maybe some of the functions of what we call the intestines. Now, when we talk about the small intestines, okay, generally, the small intestines, they are going to be responsible primarily for what we call absorption of nutrients. Okay, that's the primary role of what we call the small intestine. And when we talk of the large intestine, they are primarily responsible for what we call absorption of water, and even also absorption of what we call electrolytes, and also formation of what we call the fecal matter. Okay, so now it is also such another beautiful thing. Okay. Now, having looked at now the functions of what we call the intestines, let's look at what we call the blood supply to the intestines. Now, you know, this the intestines are going to be having a great of the supply with the blood. What are those vessels that supply what we call the intestines? On the abdominal aorta, we have that those blood vessels that lives off the abdominal aorta. We have what we call the superior mesenteric artery and then the inferior mesenteric artery. Those are the two primary the blood vessels that are going to be supplying oxygenated blood to what we call the intestines. Okay, and then of course for the case of the drainage system, just opposite, it's what we call the superior mesenteric vein and then the inferior mesenteric vein, which together combine and then become part of what we call hepatic portal vein. As they suck out all the nutrients and they converge it to what we call the hepatic portal vein, and then the nutrients are taken to what we call the liver for other metabolic processes. Okay, so that's going to be what we call supply and drainage to what we call the intestines. Okay. And then, of course, when we talk about these intestines, they are going to be having the same layers throughout what we call the GIT. We're going to be having the inner what we call mucosa. We're going to be having the submucosa. We're going to be having the muscularis externa, and then the serosa outside. Okay, so now the whole of these intestines are going to be having also those kind of four arrangement of what we call the layers. Okay. And then, of course, talking about something little about the innervations, you're going to be having also what we call embedded in within these intestines. We're going to be having what we call enteric nervous system, okay, where we have what we call the submucosal plexus and then the enteric plexus. All of them are going to be embedded within what we call the submucosal layer for the case of submucosal plexus, and then the muscularis externa for the case of what we call enteric plexus, dealing with what we call secretions and even also what we call peristalsis and even also what we call segmentation that aims at what we call mixing of the foods within the small intestine. Okay. And then also we have what we call this kind of the small intestine. What are some of those adaptations that enable the small intestines to perform their work? These kind of small intestines, in the next video, we're going to be cutting a small portion of the small intestine. We see it inside. We realize that you're going to be having what we call the circular folds, which you call the plica circularis. Okay. We also have what you call the villi. We also have what you call the microvilli, which are going to be on the apical surface of what we call the enterocytes. All of these ones together, they are going to be increasing the surface area for what we call absorption of the nutrients. They are such a beautiful things, okay? So now, having looked at that, let's go ahead and see the difference between what we call the large intestine and even also what we call the small intestine, because they are worth to be known, okay? When you see this kind of this structure, the small intestine, the large intestines, they are super very different, okay? Now, looking at what we call the diameter, okay? We shall have what we call the diameter. Okay. Now, you realize that the large intestine are going to be having a wider diameter compared to what we call the small intestine, okay? This one can even be seen with your naked eyes from here, that this one is going to be having a wider diameter compared to what we call the small intestine, okay? Now, talking about the lengths, okay? Talking about the lengths. And of course, the small intestine is going to be very long. You know how long the small intestine is? The small intestine, they are generally between 6 to 7 meters long, okay? 6 to 7 meters long. And for the case of the large intestine, they are just close to around 1.5 meters long, okay? So now you can see that the small intestines are very long compared to the large intestine, which just moves like this, a transverse, then descending, and then also what we call these other portions of the large intestine. So now, in length, the small intestine are very long compared to what we call the large intestine, okay? And then talking about the main function, okay? Talking about the main function, because you realize that these kind of the intestine are going to be playing different roles. Now, for the case of the small intestines, they are primarily responsible for absorption of what we call nutrients. That's the primary role of what we call the small intestines, okay? And then we talk about the large intestine. For them, they are mainly responsible for the absorption of what we call water, electrolytes, and even formation of what we call the fecal matter, okay? So now that also differentiates between what we call the small intestine and then the large intestine. Now, when we cut this kind of small intestine and we cut the large intestine and we view it inside, you're going to be seeing even also structural differences. What are these structural differences? We are going to be seeing what we call the villi, okay? We're going to be seeing what we call the villi. Now, when you look inside the lumen of what we call the small intestine, you're going to be seeing what we call the villi. But the villi in large intestine, they are not there, okay? In large intestine, the villi are absent. We do not have villi within the large intestine. The villi, they are only part of what we call the small intestine. So now this one also becomes a differentiating structural feature, okay? So now, generally, those are some of the common functions, those are some of the common differences between the large intestine and even also the small intestine, okay? So now, this briefly covers the anatomy and then some little bit of the functions, the differences of what we call the intestines. And if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you are benefiting, please support me. And that one can be done by a couple of minutes. You just like the video, comment down the comment section, share the video with someone else whom you think that is in need of this information. And at the end of it all, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you very much for watching. It has been TUMNAD as always. Until we meet next time.